I wrote about it in the book because I just thought it was something that people needed to hear, that no matter what you go through, you can always find your way back to love and forgiveness. Wish he hadn't died after that. It would have been nice to spend some more time with him. But yeah, I was grateful that we had that.
At 65, Valerie Bertinelli has revealed Eddie Van Halen's deathbed confession. What happened in that hospital room was not farmed by headlines or legacy, but by something far more fragile. The story does not unfold like a scandal. It reads more like a quiet unraveling of decades, where fame, illness, and memory converged in a final conversation. But to truly understand what was said, we need to start from the very beginning. Let's get started. A collision of two worlds. In the late 1970s, the American entertainment landscape split into two parallel universes that rarely touched. One was television, the other was rock music. It was inside that divide that Eddie Van Halen and Valerie Bertinelli emerged on completely different trajectories before fate forced their collision. By 1978, Eddie Van Halen had already reshaped the language of guitar playing. With Van Halen's debut album released that year, he was not just another rock musician, he was a technical disruptor. His tapping technique, speed control, and improvisational tone turned him into a reference point for an entire generation of guitarists. The band's rapid commercial rise followed immediately. By the early 1980s, Van Halen was filling arenas across the United States, supported by relentless touring schedules that kept the band on the road for most of the year. At the same time, Valerie Bertinelli had become a household name through the hit sitcom One Day at a Time, which premiered in 1975. By her late teens and early 20s, she was already positioned as America's girl next door. While Eddie was performing in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans, Valerie was filming in controlled studio lighting in Los Angeles. Their worlds intersected unexpectedly in 1980. It happened at a Van Halen concert in Shreveport, Louisiana. The meeting was not orchestrated by publicity teams or industry networking. It was immediate and personal. Eddie, already in the middle of a meteoric rise with the band's second album, Van Halen II, still fresh in public memory, was operating in a constant state of travel and performance. Valerie attended the concert, and the encounter sparked an immediate connection that defied their contrasting lifestyles. Within months, the interaction evolved into a relationship that accelerated with unusual speed, even by Hollywood standards. The early phase of their courtship unfolded under intense public fascination. By 1981, Van Halen had released Fair Warning, reinforcing their status as one of the dominant forces in rock music. At the same time, Valerie remained a central television presence, meaning both individuals were already embedded in separate but equally demanding entertainment systems. The media attention surrounding their relationship framed it as a cultural anomaly. A rock guitarist known for a chaotic touring life, becoming romantically linked to a primetime television star associated with family-friendly America. In April 1981, they married in California. Almost immediately after the marriage, structural pressures began to surface. Eddie's touring commitments with Van Halen intensified as the band entered one of its most commercially successful periods. The release of Women and Children First in 1980 and later Fair Warning in 1981 positioned the band at the center of global rock culture. Tours stretched across continents, often requiring months of continuous travel. This created prolonged physical separation, with Eddie frequently absent from home life. Within that environment, the relationship began absorbing external pressures tied to fame itself. Eddie's growing public status came with increasing scrutiny, not only of his music, but of his lifestyle. The rock industry at the time was deeply intertwined with substance culture, and Van Halen existed at the center of that ecosystem. While the band maintained professional success, the environment surrounding them was unstable, with long nights, unpredictable routines, and little separation between performance and personal life. Valerie, meanwhile, continued operating within the structured environment of television production. The contrast was psychological. One partner lived in cycles of adrenaline and exhaustion, while the other worked within scheduled routines and scripted storytelling. This divergence began shaping the early instability beneath their public image, as the logistical reality of their careers made consistent shared time increasingly difficult. The birth of their son, Wolfgang, would later become a stabilizing factor, but in this early period, the foundation of their relationship was already under strain from distance and lifestyle incompatibility. Eddie's career demanded constant mobility, while Valerie's required geographic stability in Los Angeles. Their relationship thus existed in overlapping but rarely synchronized time frames. By the early 1980s, Van Halen's commercial peak had fully materialized, with the band becoming one of the highest-grossing rock acts in the world. Their 1984 album would later cement this dominance, but even before that release, the momentum created an environment in which Eddie's time and attention were heavily consumed by touring cycles and studio obligations. That level of demand left limited space for personal equilibrium. At the same time, Valerie's public identity remained consistent, but her private life was now subject to increasing media attention due to the relationship. The collision of their two worlds had created a foundation that was both compelling and fragile. Disaster was only a wrong turn away. Addiction, health crisis, and relationship breakdown. By the 1990s, the trajectory of Eddie Van Halen had shifted from explosive ascent to sustained pressure under the weight he could no longer outrun. Van Halen was now an established global machine, but behind that success, Eddie's personal stability was increasingly compromised by long-term struggles with alcohol and use of controlled substances that had gradually intensified since the band's peak touring years in the early 1980s. What had once been framed as part of the rock environment became, over time, a destabilizing factor that began affecting reliability, focus, and emotional consistency. By the early to mid-1990s, these struggles were no longer isolated incidents. They began intersecting directly with the band's internal structure. Van Halen experienced multiple lineup changes during this period, including the departure and return cycles involving lead vocalists such as David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar. Each transition brought renewed creative conflict. Eddie, as the band's primary creative force, was at the center of these tensions. At the same time, the broader music industry itself was changing. The dominance of hard rock and glam metal from the 1980s was giving way to alternative rock and grunge. Van Halen remained commercially viable, but the environment around them was no longer as stable or predictable as it had been during their peak stadium years. The turning point in Eddie's health narrative came when he was diagnosed with oral cancer. This was the structural rupture in his life. Treatment included aggressive medical intervention, which at one point involved partial removal of his tongue. The illness also introduced a visible shift in the emotional dynamic of his marriage with Valerie Bertinelli. Shockingly, Eddie continued to smoke despite explicit medical warnings. This behavior became a recurring point of conflict that symbolized deeper issues of control, denial, and self-destructive cycles. As Eddie moved through treatment and recovery phases, the emotional distance between the couple expanded further. The marriage, already strained by years of touring, separation, and substance-related instability, now had to absorb the weight of serious illness. Health crises often compress relationships, but in this case, they also exposed unresolved patterns that had accumulated over more than a decade. The stress was embedded in daily life. During this same period, Van Halen continued to function as a major touring and recording act, but the internal cohesion of the band remained fragile. Creative disagreements became more frequent, and the balance between artistic direction and personal well-being grew increasingly difficult to maintain. Eddie's role as both guitarist and central creative driver meant that much of the pressure ultimately concentrated on him, further compounding existing personal struggles. By the late 1990s, the convergence of addiction history, cancer recovery, professional instability, and long-term emotional strain created a sustained period of fragmentation. The relationship between Eddie and Valerie was weakening under continuous pressure. Emotional disconnection became more pronounced. Time together no longer functioned as restoration, but as confrontation with accumulated history. Health concerns added urgency to interactions, while past patterns of behavior remained unresolved. Even shared concern for family stability, particularly involving their son Wolfgang Van Halen, was filtered through an increasingly fractured emotional landscape. The early 2000s marked the final structural collapse of the marriage as a functioning unit. By 2001, after years of deteriorating stability, separation occurred. This was not a sudden rupture, but the end point of a long trajectory shaped by overlapping crises. The separation formalized what had already become a lived reality. What makes this period particularly complex is that it was not defined by a single cause. Instead, it was the accumulation of multiple pressures that reinforced one another over time. Health decline increased emotional stress, which intersected with existing behavioral patterns, which were further intensified by professional instability. Each layer fed into the next, creating a system that gradually lost equilibrium. By the time separation occurred in 2001, the marriage had already transitioned through multiple states: public image, private strain, medical crisis, and emotional fragmentation. But this was not the end. Divorce, parallel lives, and lingering connection. After the separation in 2001, the relationship between Eddie Van Halen and Valerie Bertinelli did not end in silence or distance in the traditional sense. Instead, it entered a prolonged transitional phase where legal separation and emotional continuity coexisted in parallel. For several years, the divorce remained unresolved on paper, but the structure of their shared life had already fundamentally changed long before the final legal step. The divorce was ultimately finalized in 2007, marking the formal closure of a process that had stretched across years of separation and gradual emotional restructuring. By that point, both individuals had already begun constructing independent lives. Eddie Van Halen got involved with Janie Leshevsky, who had been working within his professional orbit for years, initially as a publicist and later as someone involved in stunt coordination and behind-the-scenes production work. Their connection developed gradually inside that environment, where long hours, shared projects, and the familiarity of touring and production schedules created proximity. By the time their relationship became public, it was not a sudden shift, but the result of an extended period of professional overlap turning personal. They eventually married in 2009, formalizing a relationship that had grown quietly in the background of Eddie's later career phase. At the same time, Valerie Bertinelli moved into a different kind of post-divorce transition. Her eventual marriage to Tom Vitale came through a more traditional social route, connected to industry-adjacent circles rather than the direct intensity of a touring rock environment. Vitale worked as a financial planner and executive, and their relationship developed over time before they married in 2011. Unlike her first marriage, which had unfolded under immediate public scrutiny and rapid escalation, this relationship followed a slower, more measured trajectory. What makes this phase particularly complex is that neither Eddie nor Valerie fully exited each other's lives while building these new relationships. Their connection remained structurally intact through their son, Wolfgang Van Halen, who acted as a constant bridge between the two otherwise separate households. Family events, such as birthdays, career milestones, and later Wolfgang's own emergence as a musician, required coordination and interaction. This meant that new partners were not entering isolated lives. They were entering an already interconnected system shaped by decades of shared history. That dynamic created an unusual form of extended family structure. Eddie's marriage to Janie Leshevsky did not erase Valerie's presence, just as Valerie's marriage did not remove Eddie from the broader family framework. In fact, one of the more telling details is that Valerie attended Eddie's wedding to Janie in 2009, a decision that reflected not emotional simplicity, but a negotiated balance between past and present. Similarly, Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, officiated both Eddie's wedding and Valerie's later remarriage, reinforcing how tightly interwoven these relationships remained. Over time, this arrangement evolved into a form of coexistence that required boundaries without complete separation. Communication between Eddie and Valerie became more structured, often centered around practical matters involving Wolfgang, but it also carried an undercurrent of familiarity that never fully disappeared. They were no longer partners in a romantic sense, yet they were not strangers either. This period also revealed a shift in emotional tone. Earlier years had been marked by volatility, fueled by addiction, career pressure, and mismatched lifestyles. In contrast, the post-divorce phase gradually moved toward a quieter, more reflective dynamic. Valerie would later describe holding multiple emotions at once: anger over the past, affection rooted in history, and regret shaped by what could not be changed. Eddie, dealing with ongoing health issues, was also moving through a phase where personal reflection became more prominent. The public perception also shifted accordingly. However, Eddie Van Halen's earlier oral cancer diagnosis never fully disappeared from the background. Instead, it lingered as a long-term threat that would resurface in more serious form later. In the immediate years after the divorce, Eddie focused on rebuilding stability, including entering rehab in 2007. That same year, he made a visible comeback on stage during Van Halen's reunion tour with David Lee Roth, which ran through 2007 and 2008 and grossed hundreds of millions globally. That comeback, however, did not mean full recovery. Physically, Eddie's condition fluctuated. Years of smoking, combined with prior cancer treatment, had already altered his stamina and overall resilience. His weight visibly dropped in certain public appearances, and there were periods where he withdrew almost entirely from public view. Still, in 2012, Van Halen released A Different Kind of Truth, their first studio album with David Lee Roth in nearly 3 decades. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. A subsequent tour followed, but reports of fatigue and canceled dates hinted that the underlying issues had not been resolved. While Eddie navigated this unstable rhythm, Valerie Bertinelli was building a different kind of momentum. By the early 2010s, she had successfully transitioned into a new phase of her career, becoming a prominent television personality beyond scripted sitcoms. Her work with the Food Network, including shows like Valerie's Home Cooking, positioned her in a space that emphasized relatability and personal storytelling rather than character acting. In 2009, she also publicly addressed her long-term struggles with weight through the Jenny Craig program, losing around 40 pounds and becoming a spokesperson, which marked a significant personal milestone tied to health and self-image. Meanwhile, the strongest continuous link between Eddie and Valerie remained their son, Wolfgang Van Halen, whose life began to intersect directly with Eddie's professional world. In 2006, Wolfgang had already joined Van Halen as bassist at just 15 years old, replacing Michael Anthony. But between 2007 and 2015, his role solidified, performing in major tours and contributing to studio recordings. By the mid-2010s, Eddie's public appearances became less frequent, and when he did appear, signs of physical decline were harder to ignore. Reports and later confirmations indicated that his cancer had returned, this time more aggressively. By around 2015, he was undergoing ongoing treatment, including travel to Germany for specialized care. It became clear retrospectively that his health had entered a more critical phase during these years. Despite this, Eddie continued to work creatively in isolation. He spent significant time in his home studio, 5150 Studios in Los Angeles, recording and experimenting with music, even when he was no longer touring. This period was marked less by public output and more by private creation. Parallel to this, Valerie's life moved further into public openness about her past. In 2008, she published her memoir, Losing It, followed by Finding It in 2009, both of which addressed her struggles with weight, relationships, and self-worth. These works offered some of the earliest detailed insights into her marriage with Eddie. including the emotional complexity and strain that had defined it. By the late 2010s, she had established a reputation not just as an actress, but as a figure willing to publicly process personal history in a way that resonated with a broad audience. By 2018, Eddie's condition had significantly worsened. Cancer had spread beyond its original site, affecting other parts of his body, including the throat and, later, other organs. He was largely out of the public eye, and his appearances became rare and carefully managed. At the same time, Wolfgang began stepping more fully into his own identity as a musician, eventually forming his own band, Mammoth UVH, signaling a generational transition even before Eddie's death. In these final years, the contrast between Eddie and Valerie's trajectories became stark. Eddie's world was shrinking physically but deepening in introspection, while Valerie's was expanding publicly through media, writing, and personal storytelling. Yet, despite these diverging paths, their connection remained intact through shared history and their son's evolving career. Then, it all fell apart. The final deathbed confession. By 2019, the life of Eddie Van Halen had narrowed into a far more private and urgent rhythm than the decades of stadium tours and global recognition that defined his peak. Health challenges that had accumulated over the years had become the central framework of his daily existence. Within that narrowing world, the final year of his life took on a pattern that would later be described by Valerie Bertinelli as unusually reflective. According to Valerie's memoir and subsequent interviews, Eddie began actively reaching out to individuals from his past during this period, initiating contact in ways that were not typical of his earlier public persona. These outreach efforts were described not as publicity-driven actions, but as personal attempts to resolve unfinished emotional threads. The focus, as she recounted it, was on closing gaps that had formed over decades of intense professional and personal turbulence. This pattern of reconnection reportedly included conversations that revisited long-standing emotional history between Eddie and Valerie herself. Their relationship, already transformed by divorce in 2007, and years of parallel lives afterward, entered a final phase. But not in the sense of a conflict. Instead, it took on a sort of retrospective clarity. In Valerie Bertinelli's memoir, Enough Already, the late-stage chapters of her relationship with Eddie Van Halen are not written as a clean emotional resolution, but as something more fragmented, moments of clarity emerging inside decades of accumulated distance. She describes their connection after divorce less as something that ended, and more as something that changed shape, especially when health began to dominate Eddie's later years. The tone she uses in reflection is consistently layered. Affection exists alongside regret, and memory is treated as something still emotionally active, rather than resolved. In interviews after publication, Valerie repeatedly returned to the idea that their communication in later years was stripped of performance. She described conversations where the weight of history was no longer avoided. In one interview, she emphasized that there was no more pretending in those final exchanges, suggesting that both of them had reached a stage where earlier tensions, fame pressure, addiction cycles, and emotional distance were no longer defensible narratives, but shared memories that needed acknowledgement rather than debate. The final Thanksgiving meeting she has referenced became the emotional focal point of this entire period. It was a turning point where structured co-parenting conversations gave way to something more unguarded. According to her recollection, the setting was not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but quiet and emotionally dense. What changed, she suggested, was not the location, but the honesty. Instead of discussing logistics around family or health updates, they entered territory that had been avoided for years. What was lost, what was never repaired, and what could no longer be changed. Valerie has described that during this exchange, Eddie openly acknowledged regret regarding their separation. The phrasing that circulated widely in media summaries, him regretting losing her, comes from her interpretation of that conversation. These late conversations were not about reconciliation in a traditional romantic sense, but about emotional accounting. The idea was not to rebuild the marriage, but to fully confront what it had been. That distinction is important in her memoir's tone. she avoids presenting the relationship as revived. Instead, she presents it as finally understood. By the time Eddie died on October 6, 2020, at age 65, the medical reality of his condition had already placed him in a prolonged state of decline. He passed in California, surrounded by his closest immediate family, including his son Wolfgang Van Halen, his brother Alex Van Halen, and his wife Janie Leshevsky. Valerie has stated that she was also present during his final period in the hospital. In the immediate aftermath of his death, public narrative formation moved quickly toward themes of closure. Media coverage and retrospectives began emphasizing reconciliation arcs, emotional forgiveness, and the idea that unresolved relationships had found completion in his final year. Valerie's memoir and interviews contributed significantly to this framing, but always with nuance. She never described a perfect resolution, only moments of emotional honesty that stood out against decades of complexity. If you look at the relationship through a counterfactual lens, the most striking question is not whether they stayed connected, but whether the timing of that connection could have changed its outcome. Valerie herself has hinted at this tension indirectly, suggesting in interviews that time changes what people are able to say. That idea implies that earlier versions of their relationship were constrained not just by conflict, but by circumstance, touring schedules, addiction cycles, fame pressure, and emotional immaturity during peak years. Had those conversations happened earlier, before health crises, before long separations hardened emotional distance, the trajectory might have looked different, but they did not. Still, they found closure in the end. Death, legacy, and aftermath. In Valerie's account, one of the final exchanges she shared with Eddie was the simple phrase, "I love you." This moment has been frequently referenced in posthumous narratives because, while it did not carry the weight of reconciliation, it did reflect an immediate, unembellished emotional expression at the end of life. Within her retelling, it marked a point of quiet resolution rather than unresolved conflict. Following his death, public and media narratives quickly consolidated around two dominant aspects of Eddie Van Halen's life: his technical revolution in music and the turbulent human story behind it. As a guitarist, Eddie Van Halen was widely credited with redefining electric guitar performance through innovations that permanently altered rock vocabulary. His two-handed tapping technique, most famously showcased in Eruption from Van Halen's 1978 debut album, became one of the most studied and imitated guitar methods in modern music history. That single track, under 2 minutes long, is often cited as a turning point in rock instrumentation, compressing speed, melody, and technique into something that reshaped what the instrument could do. Across the 1980s, Van Halen became one of the most commercially successful rock bands in the world. Albums like 1984 produced stadium-defining hits such as Jump, which reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, marking a rare crossover moment where technically complex rock became mainstream pop dominance. The band's global tours consistently sold out arenas across North America, Europe, and Asia, placing Eddie in the upper tier of live performance earners during that era. At its peak, Van Halen was not just a band, but an industry-level force, shaping both the sound and business model of arena rock. Eddie's influence extended far beyond commercial success. Guitarists across multiple genres, from hard rock to metal to alternative, have repeatedly cited him as a foundational influence. His tone engineering, use of modified equipment, and experimental recording techniques in his home studio 5150 became part of the technical mythology of modern guitar production. Even outside of rock, his approach to sound layering and improvisation influenced studio musicians and producers seeking more expressive electric textures. At the same time, posthumous discussions increasingly emphasized the instability that accompanied his career. Long-term struggles with substance use, periods of health decline, and personal turbulence became central to how his life story was reinterpreted after 2020. But what made Eddie's experience feel less like an isolated case and more like a pattern, was how closely it mirrored the wider reality of rock music's most visible figures from the same era. The culture surrounding late 1970s and 80s arena rock, where Eddie Van Halen rose, was structurally intense in a way that left very little separation between performance, travel, and excess. Touring cycles often stretched across continents for months at a time, with bands moving from stadium to stadium in rapid succession. In that environment, substance use was a coping mechanism for exhaustion, pressure, and constant public demand. This pattern was not unique to Van Halen. Many of Eddie's contemporaries experienced similar trajectories. Members of bands like Aerosmith, especially Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, have publicly discussed periods of heavy alcohol and controlled substance use during their peak years in the late 1970s and early 80s, to the point where the group became widely associated with the term the Toxic Twins. Aerosmith eventually underwent a well-documented recovery phase in the mid-1980s, but only after near collapse as a functioning unit. In another parallel, Ozzy Osbourne's time with Black Sabbath and his early solo career reflected a similar cycle of extreme fame followed by substance-related instability. Even bands like the Rolling Stones, with figures such as Keith Richards, became emblematic of long-term exposure to substance-heavy lifestyles in rock culture. Richards's survival through decades of public scrutiny and documented substance use in the 1970s contributed to the broader perception that endurance in that ecosystem often required either recovery, transformation, or sheer unpredictability in personal resilience. The touring economy of the 1970s and 80s was built around relentless schedules, minimal rest cycles, and constant media exposure. Artists were expected to perform at peak intensity. All the while, they were navigating fame on a global scale, often without the support systems that exist in modern touring environments. In Eddie Van Halen's case, this environment intersected with additional pressures: creative control within Van Halen, shifting band lineups, and the expectation of constant innovation after redefining guitar technique with early tracks like Eruption. These elements did not replace his achievements, but reframed them within a dual narrative: extraordinary creative output paired with sustained personal struggle. Within this broader legacy framework, the relationship between Eddie and Valerie Bertinelli became a recurring reference point. Rather than being treated solely as a concluded Hollywood marriage, it was frequently revisited as a long-form emotional structure that evolved over time. Their marriage in 1981 brought together two distinct cultural worlds: television stardom and arena rock, while their divorce in 2007 did not fully dissolve their connection due to shared history and co-parenting responsibilities involving their son, Wolfgang Van Halen. Valerie herself was not a peripheral figure in this legacy narrative. Known initially for One Day at a Time, she later expanded into authorship, memoir writing, and food television, building a second public identity that existed independently of her early Hollywood fame. Her memoir, Enough Already, became a key source in shaping public understanding of her relationship with Eddie, particularly in its depiction of emotional complexity rather than simple resolution. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.